Hello and welcome to Crossroads of Rockland History. I'm Clare Sheridan from the Historical Society of Rockland County. On October 30th, the Historical Society partnered with the Northwest Bergen History Coalition on their annual History Luncheon. The speaker at the luncheon was our own Rockland County historian, Craig Long, and the topic of the lecture was Protecting the Ramapo Pass, George Washington's little-known fortifications at Sidman's Bridge. This lecture made me think about a past episode of Crossroads where we spoke to Rockland County historian Craig Long about the Ramapo Pass and its importance. And with the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 2026, it felt like a good time to look back at this important topic. In addition to revisiting this earlier episode, I'll share a summary of this important piece of New York State Revolutionary War history written by the late Thomas F.X. Casey, former Rockland County historian. Casey's summary was part of his remarks at the 225th anniversary of the Camp Ramapough Entrenchments in Hillburn in 2001. This episode of Crossroads of Rockland History is sponsored by the town of Ramapough. We are grateful for the town of Ramapough's support of local history and the Historical Society of Rockland County. The Historical Society is a nonprofit educational institution and principal repository for original documents and artifacts relating to Rockland County. Its headquarters are a 4-acre site featuring a history museum and the 1832 Jacob Blauvelt House located at 20 Zucker Road in New City, New York. It's listed on the National Register of Historic Places and a designated New York State Path Through History site. Part of our broad and challenging mission is to share the history of Rockland County with the public. The Historical Society is a nonprofit institution, not a county or state agency, and we rely on financial contributions from people just like you. I hope you will consider becoming a member of the Historical Society or making a tax-deductible contribution to help us meet our mission. If you're interested in donating, becoming a member of the Society, learning about volunteer opportunities, or upcoming events and programs, please visit our website at rocklandhistory.org. The following is an excerpt of South of the Mountains, 2002, Volume 46, Number 1. The 225th anniversary of Camp Ramapough Entrenchments. On December 12, 2001, historians and public officials gathered with local residents to commemorate the 225th anniversary of the Camp Ramapough Entrenchments in Hillburn, New York. They met off Old Route 17 in an area known as Fox Hollow, where the Daughters of the American Revolution had marked one of 2 lines of the Revolutionary War entrenchments with a granite plaque on a large boulder. The site was deeded to the Historical Society of Rockland County in 1979. Society trustees Joseph Holland and Stephen Perrell had been working with Nick Morangi, co-owner of the neighboring Crossroads Truck Wash, to improve the entrenchment site. The main entrenchment line was built from the east side of the Ramapo Pass to Sidman's Bridge, which crossed the Ramapo River. Another line was built on the upland hollow west of Little Mountain, where the recent commemoration took place. At the ceremony, Kenneth Conklin showed a model of the 2-story blockhouse that had stood near Sidman's Bridge. The model was made by a friend of the late Brad Bobb, commander of the Shore Guard, a reenactment Revolutionary War unit. Historical Society of Rockland County senior historian and trustee Thomas F.X. Casey related the history of the entrenchments as follows. During the War for American Independence, the area where we gather was known as the Ramapo Clove. Clove is the Dutch word for pass. At that time, at least part of this area was also known as Smith's Clove. Through the years, it also became known as the Ramapo Pass, and in his book by the same name, Richard Koch calls it the Corridor Through the Mountains. Whatever the name, this pass through the highlands was used first by the Native Americans, followed by the early settlers. Remember that the original Orange County included both present-day Rockland and Orange counties. The county seat was located at Tappan, and the pass was one of the few ways settlers from, quote, north of the mountains, unquote, could travel to conduct their legal business. In the 19th century, the Erie Railroad came through, followed by Route 17 and the New York State Thruway. The road through this clove entered the mountains at Suffern, where the pass is a width of about a quarter of a mile. It then passed a hill known as Little Mountain. On its westerly side, the hill is separated from the main mass of the Ramapo Mountains by a shallow valley pass through which old Route 17 now passes. The village of Hillburn is nestled to the south. To the east, the Clove Road ran parallel to the Ramapo River and crossed the river by a bridge, which became known as Sidman's Bridge. The bridge got its name from a nearby tavern. During the French and Indian War, which lasted from 1755 to 1763, a fort was built just north of Sidman's Bridge. According to Robert Erskine's survey, which was made for the Continental Army, the purpose of the fort was to prevent Native Americans, who were allied with the French, from attacking the colonial settlements along the Hudson River. The fort was erected in anticipation of an attack from the west, but with the outbreak of the Revolution and the occupation of New York City by the British in 1776, an invasion either by way of the Hudson River or overland through the Ramapo Pass was the danger most feared by the Americans. Forts Clinton and Montgomery were built in the highlands beyond Bear Mountain and were designed to stave off an attack from the Hudson. If an attack was to come by land, the pass was regarded as the most likely route. Under direct orders from General Washington, Major General William Heath, the commander in charge of the Hudson Highlands, ordered approximately 400 men to occupy the Ramapo Clove. The order was issued on November 13, 1776. The forces sent were the 10th Continental Infantry under the command of Colonel John Tyler and the 17th Continental Infantry under the command of Colonel Jedediah Huntington. Huntington, as senior in rank, was given command. Washington called the valley, because of its narrowness, quote, a defile very easily defended, unquote. Huntington set up a line of musketry that ran across the valley below the bridge and, quote, a little redoubt, unquote, north of the river that covered the bridge crossing, and an earthwork beyond the stream. On November 23rd, Huntington wrote to Heath that he would not be able to do more than complete a, quote, musketry line, unquote, that season, considering that the construction of the barracks would take the rest of the time. He also stated that 3 or 4 cannons could be used advantageously to command the pass. After the British captured Forts Clinton and Montgomery in October of 1777, General Clinton withdrew the permanent garrison from the fort here. He needed the troops elsewhere. Until the end of the war, the post was occupied by Continental soldiers when circumstances demanded it. A descendant of John Suffern, James Boggart Suffern, gifted this quarter-acre plot to the Ramapo Valley Chapter Daughters of the American Revolution. The presentation of the deed and the dedication of the marker took place on June 28, 1904. With the cooperation of all the interested party that are gathered here today, let us hope that what remains of this small but significant part of the war for independence will still exist 225 years from now. And now we'll revisit that past episode with County Historian Craig Long from January of 2021. Hello, Craig, and thank you for coming back to Crossroads of Rockland History.
Good morning, Claire. Thank you for having me. It's always a joy. I'm probably one of your top fans.
Oh, thank you. So, of course, you've been on the program before, speaking about your Images of America book about Suffern. You spoke about Prohibition, the Suffern Village Museum, and other topics. But for those few listeners who do not know you, take a moment to just describe yourself for the audience.
Well, I was born and raised in Rockland County and reside in Suffern. I married a local girl, a Suffern girl, who has long-standing roots in the county as well. Robin, she was a Gutchess. She is a second-grade teacher in the Suffern School District. We have 3 grown children, and as you said, I'm privileged to be the historian for a great county and also for several villages. But I think one of the things about those of us in the history world, we've got a great support network of local historians. Both the municipal historians and great historians like yourself, Claire, who get this kind of information out. And I think especially, I've teased you before about, your crossroads of Rockland history kind of being the fireside chat. But I think it really, when you look at today's society, certainly with what's happened with the pandemic, many of our older citizens who really rely on living in the past in terms of good memories, fond memories for themselves, you provide an excellent service through this, because many of them are not able to Zoom into maybe local history, meetings that are happening, or don't feel comfortable enough about going out to historical sites for social distancing. So, I really have to give you a lot of credit for, the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you very much. And as we know, this program really was the brainchild of the Leadership Rockland and Carrie Potter and you talking about, how could we get history on the radio. So thank you for your kind words. We're very pleased to be doing this. There is so much history in Rockland, as you said, and certainly when it comes to the American Revolution, that's no exception. And, we've been on the air now for over 10 years, over 100 episodes we've put in the can here, and we haven't really ever delved into the Ramapo Pass and the Clove Road. So to kick off the conversation, can we first establish that in the 18th century, what we know as Rockland County was part of Orange County, right?
Yes. It wasn't until 1798 that we became a county, aptly named Rockland. And I think anybody that has done any building or any gardening, or anybody that's attempted to put a shovel in the ground, I think they fully know why we received that name of Rockland County. And it's interesting, too, that you mentioned that in terms of our, we were part of Orange County, and the separation occurs along the line, the ridge of the Ramapo Mountains.
Right, exactly. So the corridor of the Ramapo Pass, became known as the Clove Road, really had significance even before any settlers arrived, Dutch or English. Isn't that right?
Yes. The Ramapo River flowed through the Clove, or the pass, or the opening, and Native Americans created footpaths, and settlers followed those footpaths. It was an area that really was resplendent with romantic scenery, and a beautiful area where summer vacationers would come and stay in the boarding houses that were in the area. And interestingly enough, many of the painters that were part of that Hudson River School, interesting, it's the Ramapo River, but the Hudson River painters came to that area and painted scenes of, the wildlife. Fishing was plentiful, game was plentiful, a lot of hunting in that area. As I said, when you talk about an area that whole south of the mountains there, that gap, that pass that opened up, really is quite significant.
Absolutely. So for those people who are not familiar with the geographic location of where the Ramapo Pass is, can you give us just a little bit of geography lesson of where that Ramapo Pass is?
Sure. I'm not as good as a Google map would be, but I think the corridor really is a result of a gap or a clove, which kind of comes from the Dutch there, cloth, when it became Anglicanized in terms of clove, in those Ramapo Mountains, which created an opening starting at Suffern, because the Native Americans referred to Suffern as Point of the Mountains. And it stretches from that opening about 23 miles up to Goshen. Mm-hmm. And if you ever have an opportunity to stand like by the Lafayette Theater and look west, you can actually see how those two mountains press down and create that opening or that gap there.
And over the years, the road through the pass became known as the Clove, and then it took on other names, which might help people understand what we're talking about geographically.
Yeah, exactly, Claire. The what was once the native footpath through the Ramapo Pass, the early settlers called it Clove because, again, that was opening, the Clove Road, and then later became known as the New York to Albany Post Road. In 1800, a company was formed to construct a turnpike in an effort to straighten out and improve that old roadway. proceeds from the stock sales and from tolls were charged to travelers to make the road pay for itself. Doesn't that sound familiar, what they do today? And the early stockholders in the company were, interestingly enough, Aaron Burr, the famous Aaron Burr, Josiah Pearson, John Suffern, among a number of others. And many people don't realize that the southern toll gate was at Sloatsburg, and that remained there until the highway was taken over, believe it or not, by the county of Rockland in 1894. Eventually, New York State obtained the responsibility for the highway. They designed it, and they actually moved it to its current location.
And we know a lot about this corridor because of the research of Richard Koch. Can you tell us a little bit about him and who he was?
Yeah, Richard Koch was a prolific writer, researcher, well-respected historian. He authored many books and articles. He wrote extensively on the American Revolution and the events in the lower Hudson Valley. Aside from being the curator at one time, talk about a busy guy, he was curator at the Bear Mountain Trailside Museum. Then he spent a time as curator of the Stony Point Battlefield State Historic Site. And I think he authored probably the definitive work. It was a 6-part series, as I remember, produced actually for the Orange County Historical Society, and it's entitled Corridor Through the Mountains. And he retired actually as the curator emeritus from the New York Historical Society.
Right.
That's not a small feat.
No, you're right, absolutely.
I mean, to be in command of that collection there for what's housed in the city is really remarkable. And just a nice guy.
Yeah.
Very, very diligent researcher and good writer.
So is it true that General George Washington said, quote, "That pass is so exceedingly important that they should never be suffered to possess it," unquote, in regards to the pass during the American Revolution?
It was of paramount importance. And you figure for about 8 years it served as the major communication link between New York and New Jersey and the Hudson Highlands up into New England. Mm-hmm. That's why the area really, when you think about it, is so replete with historical figures who traveled through, many of whom stayed in the various homes, in the area. Washington realized that gap or pass could divide the colonies in half. So really, whoever had control of that, really, it was the major transportation corridor. He also was concerned about the Hudson River. That's why he put the chain across the Hudson River. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, the links for the chain were made up in this area that we're talking about in terms of the Clove, in terms of Sterling, mm-hmm. and the ironworks there, mm-hmm. and then transported over. So you also realize that, okay, you can't just have a bunch of people standing around at an opening. He decided to erect fortifications there at an area that was known as Sidman's, because of the fact of the Sidman family being there and a tavern that was there, and had created the blockhouse and entrenchments. The entrenchments are still partially visible if you're on the old Route 17 and opposite Mount Fuji restaurant. You'll see a section there. There is a granite marker that was there that, interestingly enough, was placed, I think, about 1904 by the daughters of the American Revolution. Mm-hmm. So see that, Claire? Mm-hmm. Not all historians are males. The ones that get things done are the women there.
That's sometimes true, yes.
But, let me just, because, again, we're talking about that Clove and that area. I think the thing also to keep in mind is that, we didn't have any major battles fought there or anything, but that Clove would later become a major transportation corridor. Not just the road going through there, but think about it. When the New York and Erie Railroad came through in 1851, what did it do? It followed that path of the Clove Road, in a sense, adjacent to that, right near the river. Then, almost 100 years later, when they were designing the New York State Thruway in 1950, before they began construction, said, okay, it's coming down from Albany. How can it get down? The only natural opening or pass was right there at the Ramapo Pass. So you've got the railroad going through there. You've got the New York State Thruway going there. You've got Route 17, Route 59. It's a major area.
Absolutely. It's been key for, centuries. Recently, due to some development in the Sloatsburg area, a site that had been part of this area is now visible from Route 17. There's a large apartment complex there, but right in the middle stands a white clapboard dwelling, the Smith House. Tell us about that structure and the significance of the site that surrounds that structure.
Well, in order to talk about that, we really have to probably go back to about 2005. I guess that's what historians do, right? We reach back. It was originally started as the Baker Properties or Baker Project. And you're right, the area you're talking about is on the south side of Route 17, just out of the village of Sloatsburg in the unincorporated area of Sterlington. And that someday may be the topic for a show. Talk about the Sterling Mine Railroad and whatnot. But anyway, I digress. There were about 55 acres there, wooded, rocky acres. They wanted to put this project in, probably about 385 units, apartment units at the time. Well, when the project was on the drawing board, I went to the supervisor at the time, Christopher St. Lawrence, and I had explained to him about the fact that there is a Revolutionary War era cemetery there, and adjacent to that is what's known as the Smith or the Mapes House. And Chris was familiar with that, and I said we really need to protect that because there's also through there was a private road, but it was the last vestige of the old Clove Road. And if you remember, there's a wonderful photograph that John Scott, the late John Scott, had taken of his dog looking down that wooded area, and you can see the remnants of the Clove Road there. Mm-hmm. So fortunately we have that. I had expressed to him that whatever development goes on, we really need to kind of protect that site. Well, eventually it became part of the Woodmont properties, and when they were filing their site plans and whatnot, they did take out an area that protected what was known as the Smith House, and then also the cemetery, and then also a small portion, not as much as I wanted, but I was lucky to get what I got, of that Clove Road. But the interesting thing about it, the reason that people need to understand why is this such an important historic site, is because that area was when the Van Blarcom family came and purchased. The first purchase in that area from the Native Americans was the Van Blarcoms, who in a sense turned it over to either the Van Duzers, Van Dusen, Van Duzer. The name has several different pronunciations and spellings. They end up selling it to the Sidmans because Sidman is the son-in-law of Van Duzer, who operates a tavern. Now, why is that important? Well, because when General Washington needs his cartographer, Erskine, to do a map of that area, on the Erskine map, 1798, you see Widow Sidman's Tavern, or you see Sidman's Tavern referred to. It's also been referred to in a number of other things when they were measuring for the state line and whatnot. So you had Sidman's Tavern there at that point, and then eventually his son-in-law is John Smith. So now do you see where we're getting the name, the Smith part of it?
Absolutely.
And he had operated a tavern there as well. Then eventually that piece of property and what would later become a house in the 1830s is sold to the Pearson estate, part of the Iron Works, because they now have hundreds and hundreds and thousands of acres, and they use that as the estate manager's house. In 1941, H. Pearson Mapes, who was part of the Ramapough Land Company, moves with his family to that house, and he has that home until he passes away in 1985.
Interesting. So the house has some significant history even beyond being the site. Of course, the Revolutionary War Cemetery is incredibly important, a piece of the Clove Road, but certainly there's history in all those people who resided there. Correct.
And, one of the things, Claire, that's why actually the marker is going to say Smith Mapes House. I felt very strongly that had H. Pearson Mapes not resided in that house and had such a deep and abiding love of local history, he really kept that house, maintained it in terms of restored it to the point where it really was a showpiece. And I know the Historical Society, I think back in the 1960s, and I think at other times, had been featured in historic house tours.
Absolutely. So tell us about the historical markers that you've been working on for this site.
Okay. Well, if I can digress just for a second.
Sure.
The only problem is part of that history tended to get a little fuzzy, when it came to, and I guess that's a good segue into when you're talking about markers, One of the things I had also asked for at the time when they were doing the site plan is that we have as many historical markers as we could get. I was able to get 3. One is for the Van Dusen or Van Duzer or Sidman Smith Cemetery, that Revolutionary War era cemetery. One for the Clove Road, and of course one for the Smith Mapes House, so that it can give people a little bit of understanding of why this is such an important piece of history, in our little triangular piece of real estate, kind of tucked all the way up there in the corner, right at the edge of what would later become Orange County. Mm-hmm. The problem was that many people had attached, and this same kind of thing happened to the house in Suffern that was known as Suffern's Tavern. People thought the house that they had torn down in the 1960s was the original Suffern house. That was not the case. Same thing with the Smith Mapes House. It is not the original tavern. That was the Sidman Tavern or the Smith Tavern during the American Revolution. Now you're going to say, well, how do you know that? Well, I think part of it is, for me, I'm a fact or evidence-based person, and there had been 4 consultants that had taken a look at the structure, and they all agree that it's built during that federal period of architecture, or Adamesque architecture, mm-hmm. which would be 1780 to about 1840, kind of evolving from that Georgian colonial revival. Yep. Mm-hmm. And the house, while it is in need of repair, is a center hall home, has 4 large rooms, high ceilings. The second floor really mirrors that. There's a total of 7 fireplaces in the house. The woodwork and the plaster is in pretty good shape considering the age. The problem is that in about 2007, when myself and the planning board chairman at the time, Richard Ackerson, went to inspect the property as part of the review process, we noticed that the house had been broken in. Upon entering in there, we saw that someone or some people had stolen all 7 mantles, wooden mantles from the fireplace in there. Mm. So we had backed out. Obviously, at that point, it's a crime scene, and then the Ramapough police, had opened up an investigation, for that larceny. In spite of that, when you take a look at the basement area, you can see that it really does not look like there's any earlier construction or anything else that had been added on there. I think one of the biggest problems that you have is that E.F. Pearson, in 1915, in his book, The Ramapo Pass, he said that house had pinned oak timbers that attest to the age, the frame of the building on that site. And this phrase was picked up and just kind of repeated. Because you figure, well, here's a Pearson, it's 1915, he's writing about, the history of the house. But when you go down into the basement and you examine, see, this is where I get into the evidence mm-hmm. piece of it. Mm-hmm. The framing down there in the cellar, all of the dimensional lumber is sawn. So it's not hand-hewn. So when they talk about timbers, they're really not timbers. And I think that when you can take a look at what's happening right around the time that most of the architectural historians believe this house was built, somewhere around 1800, it may be on the site or adjacent to the site of the original Sidman Tavern. Now, large house, is it possible that Smith may have entertained guests? Yeah. I mean, we can't think of taverns like we do in the modern sense.
Right.
So you have people coming through, you open up your door, you let them stay there, and they could have stayed at the Sloat House, the Sloat's Tavern, they could have stayed at Suffern's Tavern. So there were different places where people with larger homes would open up and take your weary guests as they'd come along.
And that's where we will wrap up today's episode of Crossroads of Rockland History. And we have some further reading for you if you're interested in learning more about Sidman's Bridge, the Ramapough Entrenchments, and the fortifications there. There's an excellent book that was mentioned earlier. The book is called Corridor Through the Mountains by Richard Koch, and that was published by the Orange County Historical Society. And that goes over the history of Smith's Clove during the Revolutionary War, where it served as a communication line and passageway for George Washington's Continental Army from 1776 to 1783. And you can get that book in your local library or from the Orange County Historical Society. at the Historical Society of Rockland County. We have our past issues of South of the Mountains. Those are archived at the New York Heritage website. So I encourage you to go online and look there to see the copy of that South of the Mountains magazine that I read from, which again was from 2002. It was volume 46, number 1. Please note that we have wonderful programs coming up for the holidays at the Historical Society of Rockland County. So please visit our website for all of that information and other events and programs that are coming up. I'm Clare Sheridan. Thanks for listening to Crossroads of Rockland History.